From 1 Corinthians. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it.
This is our third week in this series on half-truths, and we have in the past discussed everything happens for a reason, and God helps those who help themselves. And hopefully we've learned that those are, at most, partially true. And the whole truth comes when we start to discover where God fits into all this and how we are created to be a part of it together with God. We have asked during this discussion that you think of half-truths yourself, things that you have heard or have said to other people that also are kind of partially true but not fully true until we bring God into the discussion as well. And these, we've asked you to pin these kinds of half-truths up on the board, and these are some of the ones that were there. It's God's will. Carrie Newcomer has been with our church a couple of times for music concerts. She was part of a regular guest for us for Darkwood Brew, and she writes and sings beautifully. And in response to the events in Orlando, she finally got on Facebook, and in fact, she was one of the first to get on Facebook and say, there are no words for this. This is a song I wrote a long time ago. We'll let this stand for what it is. And that was her song that I heard it now. That the only way through is love, and that there are no words, and love is the action that gets us through. So one of the chorus that she says is, don't tell me that hate is ever right or that it's God's will. Because we put those things in motion ourselves, not God. So the idea that it's God's will isn't really all that helpful for any of us, I don't think. Everything happens for the best. It's a lot like that. Everything happens for a reason, as if God's the one that puts things in motion. And the good people will be healthy and prosper. That's kind of that Joel Osteen prosperity gospel thing, that if you're just good and right and do everything like the way you're supposed to, you will be blessed and you will prosper. How many of you know people that aren't necessarily good and are prospering just fine? Yeah, so there's loopholes in there somewhere, I don't know. Someone told me that after a loss of a child, someone told her that she wasn't really yours to begin with. Not helpful. The more you give, the more you get. There's good and bad in that, right? Kind of depends on what you're talking about. Insinuating that prayer leads to recovery, so losing someone means that they were not properly prayed for. That's one where it's kind of hard to explain, but usually in grief situations, a lot of times you'll say, oh, we had this great story about a woman in church who lost someone or had someone that was really sick, and the whole church prayed and the prayer chain went out and everything was great and the person recovered. Praise God. Yes, praise God, that happens. But what about those people who don't recover? Does that mean they weren't properly prayed for? So you have to be careful how you say those things. That they are in a better place now, or that God needed another angel in heaven. I don't know. Is there a limit to how many angels God needs in heaven, really? I don't know. I ask. And it's all just part of God's plan, as if there's some kind of end route that we're all leading to, and that God has predetermined that and helping us get there. Now, what's, I think, weird about these half-truths is that the image that it gives us about who God is sometimes is distorted. Not only that it's not helpful in comfort for folks, but it also, I think, sends the wrong message sometimes about what you really believe about God. Like God has a plan, or God has a purpose for all things, or all those things. Is what we really understand about who God is that God is someone who has this predetermined end game and then just manipulates all of us to make sure we get there? Is that truly what we believe about God? Or is there a different message that we want to talk about? How do we become involved in that situation then, if that's the truth about God? And then also, what does that say about humanity? Does that mean that doesn't matter how we act, that we don't have to engage in each other's lives, that we don't have to care for one another because God's got everything under control? This is why we're taking the time to actually discover and discuss these kinds of phrases so that we can look deeply into what we say and why we say them and see if maybe there's a better way to say them to get across the points we're trying to make. So today we're going to talk about God won't give you more than you can handle. How many of you have ever believed this? Yeah? Okay. I want to believe this. I do want to believe this. I believe that God is with me and God will not give me more than I can handle. Darkness will not overcome me, right? I am in the 3rd week of life without Eric. And it's getting deep. It's getting pretty deep. I'm wondering, how much more I can handle. The fact that I'm standing here is pretty much a huge thing. If I make it all the way through, we'll be good. We'll be golden. But there is a half-truth about this, right? God is with us. God does not want us to suffer. God is helping us through that suffering, right? But clearly, there are tons of people who have been overwhelmed, who have suffered, right? Who are suffering, who find things that they just can't handle. What is this room that we're sitting in? What do we call it? A sanctuary. And sanctuary literally means a place of refuge, a place safe from pursuit of danger or trouble. Clearly, we have come through 100% of our trials just simply because we're here, right? We have done that. But is that the point? Are we supposed to just survive and show up on Sunday morning? Is that a good thing? That we have come through whatever we need to come through so that we can come together here on Sunday morning? Or is it because we're overwhelmed with things that we come here on Sunday morning? The sanctuary is a place to come precisely because we do feel overwhelmed, because we do have struggles, and we need each other to get through those. We need to listen for God's voice to help us find a way through. That's what sanctuary is all about. So I would challenge this in the sense that it's not just about surviving and getting through, but literally finding meaning and joy and engagement with others in the midst of that. And sanctuary helps us think through how we can do that together and where God fits into all that and how we fit in with what God is already doing. So that would be my challenge for you today, to think about this half-truth. God doesn't give you more than you can handle, in a way that challenges where you are in your community as well as where God is involved and engaged in our community. Clearly, there are people in the Bible that have been overwhelmed, right? That have been in a place where they couldn't handle things. Stephen was stoned. I don't think he felt like he had much grasp on handling things when his peers were throwing stones at him. I don't think John the Baptist felt he had everything all together and things were handled when Herod's wife demanded his head on a platter. I don't think Abel felt able to handle Cain when Cain decided Abel needed to die. And what about that guy that was by the side of the road dying before the Samaritan came along to help? Probably not really in control of all the things that were happening, right? Not handling things pretty well. So the Bible clearly tells us that this thing is not really true. It's not God giving us suffering just as a test. And look at our own culture and our own community currently. Clearly, We have tons of people that are over their heads and unable to handle things. All of us felt over our heads when hearing about Orlando or Sandy Hook or San Bernardino or any of the other horrific things that have happened throughout history. What about the continual Middle East conflict? No one seems to be able to handle that one. And our refugees, they had to give up trying to handle anything, right? They're not even trying anymore. They just let go. What happens to them? They don't have the resources anymore to even pretend that they have things handled. So where is God in that for them? Those are the things we need to consider with what we say. This origin of this half-truth, God only gives you what you can handle, Adam Hamilton says, comes from this verse in 1 Corinthians. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. It's a little bit different than quite saying God won't give you more than you can handle. So when I went back to look at some of the original Greek in it, the word for test or tempt was there to, that gives a slightly different message to the thing. It's not about God being some wonderful supreme being above all of us, looking down and giving us all kinds of experimental things that happen in our lives just to see how much we can stand. But rather, the idea of temptation is involved in that. And in the idea that we're all tempted by things in life. Things happen to us in life, and we're tempted to go a different way from what God desires for us. And that left to our own devices, we most likely would do that all the time. That's what's happening here. This is not what God is doing to us. This is what we are doing to ourselves. And are we paying attention to God's desire for us so as not to be tempted or not to be overcome by the temptation and, in fact, follow where God's desire leads us? That's the question that I think comes through Eugene Peterson's version of this quote, or this Bible text from the Message. And he says it this way: no test or temptation that comes your way is beyond the course of what all others have had to face. We all struggle, and we all face temptation. That's what life gives us, not what God gives us, right? And all you need to remember is that God will never let you down. He will never let you be pushed past your limit. He will always be there to help you come through it. It's not that God gives you these struggles to test you, but rather life throws things at you, and God is there to help you endure it. Find a way through when you couldn't find one yourself. That's what Adam Hamilton suggests is the full truth behind this half-truth. And that when you actually look at the text itself that may have given rise to this, that's not itself biblical. Then you can start looking at what that really means and how God's really working in the midst of that. It's not a test. It's coming with us, alongside us, beneath us, beside us, behind us, above us, to help us endure the struggles that we face every day. So how do we change? How do we turn around and shift our way of thinking just enough to see how God is working through these struggles with us? Adam Hamilton has a clip from his DVD on this series that the small groups are using that I think is helpful in this respect. So let's listen to his perspective.
Wrong with this, I think. One of them goes back to session 1 and the idea that God is giving you this stuff to handle anyway. So the idea is that, okay, God has just laid on you the death of a loved one, and you've lost your job, and you're depressed, and God just gave you all this. But don't worry, God won't give you any more than you can handle. So if any one thing happens, it must be because you're really strong, because God knows you can handle it. Well, we've already sort of debunked the idea that God is the one who's testing us by giving us all these horrible things in our lives. And James tells us that God doesn't test us or tempt us with evil, doesn't seek to destroy us, but instead is coming along to strengthen us and help us. So, this is part of the problem with God won't give you more than you can handle. But I think what's maybe a better way of thinking about this, and it's just shifting it slightly, is that God will help you handle all that life has given you. Right? Life is going to give you stuff. Stuff is going to happen in life that's hard and difficult, and other people are going to do things that hurt you and break your heart. And it's not that God is laying these things on you to test you to see how much you can handle, but instead God promises to help you handle all that you've been given. And that I find is a small little change, but it's a really important one. And there's a couple things that are wrong with this, I think. One of them goes back to session 1 and the idea that God is giving you this stuff to handle anyway.
Okay, we got a loop going. So if you didn't get that the first time, you'll get it the second time for sure. And I'm sure I've said it 2 or 3 times already too, so you'll do it. So the shift is not God won't give you more than you can handle, but rather God helps us handle all that life gives us. And that's a very important shift to make sure that we hear. Because it is partially true, but it's about who's doing the action where that makes it fully true, right? And we're participating in that. And we have all kinds of examples of ways that we are participating in what God's doing in the world. And God uses us to be the things that engage with one another, that carry the Spirit to one another, that feel the Spirit and share it with one another. And we can engage in that in lots of different ways. And I think one of the dangers of these half-truths, and why I think we need to discuss them and expose them, so to speak, is because I think a lot of times these half-truths are used as excuses for not to engage with one another in the world. Those two people that are sitting side by side, it's very easy to walk up to someone and say, "Oh, hang in there. God won't give you more than you can handle," and then walk away. And leave these people wondering how God is going to help them handle this situation, right? When instead, I think what 1 Corinthians is calling us to do is to engage with one another, to participate with God in what God's doing, to help each other handle the things that come at us. Instead of using it as an excuse to distance ourselves from one another, we need to use it as an excuse to come together, as a reason to face the responsibility that we have been given to one another in creation. Remember the naming of the animals and the co-creation part of what God calls us to be in creation? We're called to be responsible for one another. And when we ignore that, we slip into these cliches. We need to be willing to make that step that closes the gap between us and literally engage in each other's lives. That means you need to both give and receive help when you need it. Adam Hamilton talks about a story of a woman who lost her husband and her son in a tragic car accident. She was so grieved that she was having problems getting up in the morning. Not one person in her community walked up to her, patted her on the back, and said, "It'll be fine. God doesn't give you more than you can handle." Instead, what they did was they moved in. They fixed breakfast. They clothed the kids that were still in the home. They fed them. They bathed them. They did their laundry. They cleaned the house. They came alongside them and helped them handle things until they could better handle it for themselves. They didn't just walk away and leave them to handle it. They helped them handle it. That's how love works. That's how God's Spirit is present among us. We speak words of love and comfort, and then we act on those words of love and comfort to help each other through those times of struggles when we are overwhelmed, when we can't handle what we've been given. Because all of us have been there. Do you remember this story about Peter walking on the water? They're in a boat, right? Peter and the disciples, And the storm is raging all around them. They're afraid, they're scared, they're trembling. And Jesus comes walking out on the water and says, "Do not be afraid, I am with you." How awesome is that? The water's calm. All of a sudden, they're not afraid. Peter has so much courage. He says, "I can do this." And he gets up and he walks out on the water. And all of a sudden, it registers in his brain what he's actually attempting to do. And he starts to sink. And he's thinking to himself as he's sinking, right? God won't give me more than I can handle. Right? That's what he's thinking. No, that's not what he's thinking. He's thinking, I'm dying. I need help. And the first thing he does is raise his hand. Right? He raises his hand up out of the water and he asks for help. And Jesus is there to lift him out of the water and into the safety of the boat. We can learn from this story. If we're all in struggles together, why are we so reluctant to ask for help? Why are we so reluctant to engage with others to offer help? If that's how we're created, to be in community with one another, why don't we do it? Why are we so afraid to ask for help? We already debunked the whole idea that God helps those who help themselves. So that doesn't work. We need an alternative plan. And the alternative plan is to face one another, to know that no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. We all have it, and we're all in it together to get each other through it. We have to be able to ask for help from God and from one another, and we have to be ready to return it when it's needed. That's what we're learning. And as we think through how our lives shift when we realize that we're in participation with God in creation, think about those times where you've ever felt overwhelmed or trapped in some kind of a situation where there was no way out, and yet somehow you got out. You got through. Maybe not without scars. Definitely not without scars. But people were there to help you resolve it, help you reconcile, help you handle things. And God is there to help you sustain them. Think of a time like that as we listen to some music.
From the 46th Psalm. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea.
A couple of years ago, we did a series called A Way Out of No Way. How many people remember that? It was a bunch of, yeah, you were all here then, good. It was a bunch of Old Testament stories, Hebrew Bible stories, right, that were talking about how When humanity tends to take things into their own hands and tries to solve their own problems, right? They're handling things. They tend to end up with their backs up against a wall somewhere between a rock and a hard place. And there is no way out. There are several stories about this, right? The stories that we talked about specifically were ones like Noah, right? Where God has to renew all of creation because we've backed ourselves into a corner. But God renews creation in the midst of our struggles. And then renewal of all covenantal agreements, right? The covenant that God makes with Abraham and Sarah to be the beginning of a great nation, and then they don't have any children. So how can they be the leaders of a great nation without any children? They're trying to figure out exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and they've come to all these other different conclusions and problem-solving issues, and then all of a sudden they've got all these babies that aren't Sarah's, and everything's going kind of crazy, and they're all fighting amongst each other. God has to step in and renew that covenant again, that promise, and Abraham and Sarah were given a child, right? And then what about those folks that were let free from Israel? God frees them and liberates them to go out and live life abundantly, and they go running away from the Pharaoh, and they go the wrong way and end up with their backs up against the sea with absolutely no way out, and Pharaoh's army chasing them from behind. God finds a way through. Not alone, but together, with God, with each other. There are alternative ways of being in the world. And if we stop listening to each other and stop listening to God, we're going to run into those walls, whether it be water, whether it be our own self-righteousness. What we're being called to do in 1 Corinthians and throughout the Bible is to be listening for God and what God's activity is already doing in the world and participating in that, in God's desire for the world. Not trying to control things on our own and getting backed up against a wall. Clearly, we have come through some pretty horrible things in our history. The Crusades, for instance, where it was the Christians who brutally attacked and destroyed the Muslims, not the other way around. And then again, Christianity stepping up against the Jews. God didn't cause these, we did. God is there looking for an alternative way through it, helping us find an alternative way. And we have come through these parts of our history, not without scars, not without lives lost, and not without pain. But we know that there are alternative ways to live than this. We've been given the resources to look for those ways. That's what we're being called to do. To not just pat people on the back and say, oh, listen, world, you're going to be okay. God won't give you more than you can handle. But to literally look for alternative ways to help us handle these situations that we all struggle with. We have the resources to make the refugees feel welcome and at home. We have the capacity to improve the conversation between Jews and Muslims and Christians through our own tri-faith. We have the capacity to look at the world in a new way of regenerating energy and keeping the environment safe and healthy for our children and our children's children. We have the choice to live an alternative way. We've been given that by God and by each other's ability to adapt and find solutions for problems rather than being the cause of them. The question remains is, Will we do it? Will we use our resources to help the refugees feel at home? Will we use our resources to provide a campus where conversation can happen and model for the world that we actually can be neighbors with one another and not kill each other? Will we invest in what it takes to put our environment first and give back to the world instead of constantly draw from it till there's nothing left? We have those choices as a community. Will we work together on this stuff and look for alternative ways of being in the world instead of just patting them on the back and saying, "Oh, world, God will come in and save us all"? Well, who are we if not God's instruments of salvation? What is our responsibility to the world, to the earth, to one another, to even this community? How can we be Emmanuel, God with us, for each other? How can we promote peace and justice and kindness in a world of violence and show an alternative way to get through a situation that appears that there is no way out? That's what we're called to be about. And we don't do it alone. God is there with us. So yes, God won't give us more than we can handle because God's already given us each other. Amen.